Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to our end of Sharp Grant Symposium, to the final meeting. I think it's finally drawing to a close. What I'm going to try to do today is talk about what we've done in the Sharp 2A project. And because this was supposed to be a TED-style talk, which means to me there's only space for about two ideas. The one idea is going to be why we did what we did, and the other idea is going to be what we did. I'll see if I can fit those in there. So, to start out with, can anyone tell me what that is? Right, it's a landmine. So, I mean, there's not a lot of options. It could be a reel of film, right? So if we were in a better world where art presided over warfare, this would be a reel of film. But as it happens, it's an anti-personnel mine, right? So they explode. They're the cause still of a large number of civilian casualties, right? They cost civilian lives and limbs in areas where they've been installed for years after the conflict in those areas has resolved. This in particular is a sort of landmine that's referred to as a low metal content landmine. So most humanitarian efforts to clear landmines involve the use of metal detectors, not too different from a standard metal detector, but that of course won't detect these very well. Which brings me to my next slide. And so what I'm doing here by way of orientation is just referring to some research that inspired our research. Of course, we didn't do research on landmines, but in fact, Jim Staszewski from Carnegie Mellon has a long line of research that relates to training people to be more effective landmine detectors. And the landmine detector that is in this image is called the PSS-14. And it was developed to deal with these low metal mines. It has, in addition to a metal detector, it also has ground penetrating radar. And the idea was by combining these signals, mine detectors would be able to get to the low metal mines that they were having trouble detecting previously. And at the time that Jim Staszewski was called in to look at this problem, the development of this mine detector had cost, let's say, more than twice the cost of the SHARPC project in its totality. And it had run for more than 10 years, but unfortunately, at that stage, the detection rate was no better than the previous mine detector. Even though it had these additional capacities, when it was placed in the hands of technicians in simulation, their detection rate in some studies was as low as 10%, which is much lower than you'd like your detection rate to be, right, as a mine detector. So what Staszewski's group did was they found that the detection rate was not uniformly bad. So there were some operators who were able to be very effective with these implements. And so they studied them. They studied the way in which these effective mine detectors were using these implements. And one of the conclusions they came to was what these experts in mine detection were doing was integrating low-level signals from the metal detector and the ground-penetrating radar into a mental representation of what the mine most likely looked like based on the signals they were getting above surface, and then mapping that to their own mental representations of the mines. So what they then, that's the reason that I found this work inspiring, was their next move was to take these findings about the way in which experts dealt with mines and develop a training program for regular mine operators. And if you look to the right of this slide, you can see the effect of their training program on the detection rates of trainees. So to cut a long story short, the very short bars at around the 10% or 5% are people before training or without training. And after this training that they developed, the detection rate was up in the 80s, or sometimes even perfect. So this implement that had been designed and a lot of research funding had gone into the development of it was only made effective after training based on expert skill. And so Staszewski has a term for this. He calls it might be pronounced CBAS, it's CBES, cognitive engineering based on expert skill. Perhaps more immediately relevant to our current problem is some work that the group has proceeded to do more recently, which is develop tools through which the work of assembling a mental representation of the landmine is offloaded onto technology. So this picture is showing a system called Petals, And what Petals does is allow users to record traces of sounds that they've heard on a visual representation of the ground that they're looking at. And so through that, they don't need to mentally assemble the spatial model of the mine. The system allows them to store it. And in evaluations in simulation of the system, they've been able to reduce the error rates, particularly with regard to false negatives, which would be mines that you failed to detect. Right? So perhaps by now you're asking, what does this have to do with SHARPC, or what does it have to do? So if you break down the model of what was happening in experts' minds here, there's some perceived data, and it's aggregated into a mental representation, and that mental representation is used to support decisions, and the quality of the mental representation affects the quality of the decision, or the accuracy of the decision. Now, it turns out that this blueprint for effective performance has also been established in the medical world. Right? So there's a rich mine of research on medical decision-making that has characterized the way in which expert decision-makers function. And it's similar to the way in which expert mind detectors function, in that low-level signs and symptoms or observations are aggregated into higher-level mental representations which support accurate decision-making. And it turns out in these studies that the difference between an effective decision-maker or an effective medical problem solver and one who's less effective is their ability to create these intermediate mental representations. Now, I think it would be remiss of me not to mention that the blueprint for all of this sort of work comes from Chase and Simon's work and chess expertise. I have found, based on this small sample, that it's a lot easier to keep an audience's attention talking about landmines than talking about chess. But I mean, I think, to be fair, there's seldom a chess game with life or death consequences, whereas with landmines and, of course, with medicine, this is often the case. So the idea behind the 2A project was to build what we called a cognitive support system, which would allow, in the same way in which the landmine support system offloaded the work of creating these mental representations, we wanted to design a cognitive support system that would take the work of creating these intermediate level mental representations that allow for the solution of problems effectively and accurately, and move it from the physician to a machine. And I'm not going to talk too much about how we did it, but I'll show you some of the things that came out of this work. So essentially what we ended up doing was modeling the decision-making process of some experts, so some of whom are in this room. So we studied their thought process related to clinical conditions of interest with a focus on sepsis, because they had a focus on sepsis, and it's clinically relevant. And we captured their decision process and built it into a knowledge model that then powered an interface. And this is one example of an interface that sits on top of that knowledge model. This is an iPad version that we developed as an early prototype. And what would happen with this is people would have the opportunity to navigate through clinical data organized in the same way in which our experts had organized it when making their decisions. And what you can see in the inset here is the small part of the total knowledge model that's relevant to this particular screen, but actually the knowledge model is much more extensive. This is another example of a system. This is an earlier prototype that came out of work that actually preceded the SHARP project that we unearthed and studied. And this is an interface that was designed for psychiatric narrative. So here we have less in the way of visual stimulus, it's all text, because psychiatry is the one area of medicine in which language itself can be a clinical sign or symptom. And what this interface does is organize the language with respect to a few key clinically relevant patterns of signs and symptoms, as we have psychosis and mood disorders, and we have one related to dangerousness, and one related to substance abuse. And what happened when we studied people using this is they were able to navigate through all of this dense text, but at a conceptual level. So this is just one example of an excerpt from a qualitative analysis of a think aloud protocol when someone was using the system. And what happened was they developed a hypothesis that this patient might be in an abusive relationship. And they followed that through to the dangerousness button. There was a button that organized information that the system thought was related to danger. And there they found confirmation for their hypothesis, but they also found some other information, most importantly for today's talk, that the patient concerned, who is a synthetic patient, right? So based on a teaching case, not a real patient. But this imaginary patient was hearing imaginary voices that told her that she should kill herself and her husband, which is not, I mean, it's not uncommon in emergency psychiatry to encounter these sorts of hallucinations. So our participant, when they encountered this, came up with the hypothesis that this patient might be having a psychotic episode, which is the sort of high-level organizing principle that we were hoping they would see. But also, it's worth noting that this particular point was buried somewhere in the middle of the narrative text, and when we looked across all of the people that we studied, it was detected by 6 of 7 people who used the interface, but only 2 of 8 people who didn't use the interface. And having worked in this sort of setting, I think I can say with confidence that it's very difficult to argue that it's not relevant to the care of this patient that they were having these auditory hallucinations with homicidal content. And so, moving on. So this is an interface that Bella showed you earlier. So this is the current front end. This has replaced the iPad as the front end. It's something that was developed in part by Peter and in part by Swaroop Gantala, who's here today as well. And what this allows us to do is switch the knowledge model on and off. So this is a front end to the knowledge model. We could switch it out for another knowledge model, but what we're doing for experimental purposes is just switching it off. So you can see the same information presented visually. So Peter would not allow us not to present this visually, right? So we are presenting trends and such. But so it's presented visually in both cases, but in the one case it's organized in accordance with the knowledge model. So in accordance with our model of expert decision making, and in the other case it's organized in a more conventional way. So the data are organized in accordance with their source, or the lab values are sorted into panels in a more traditional way. And what we've been doing recently is studying the way in which this affects the processing of participants. So just to give you a walkthrough, so what you're seeing here is a representation of the actions and thoughts of one participant using the system. In this case, they're using the base form of the system, but the participant is an expert. And at the bottom here, beneath the surface, you can see the log data. So I've been, since I read this Dazuski work, I've been very envious of the way in which, in his studies, he was able to characterize the movements of minesweepers in a very high level of granularity. And so this is our attempt to sort of capture the sweep of attention of people as they move through the system. So anytime they mouse over anything, it's logged. But then we've also combined this with data from Think Aloud protocol, so we can see what they're thinking as they navigate. And the one thing I wanted to point out from this image was just this level. So here in this visualization, we've arranged the elements of the Think Aloud protocol in terms of the level of abstraction and the level of these intermediate constructs, or the patterns that aid recognition and decision making, has been labeled 5. So you can see this expert is doing a fair amount of this sort of thing when they use the system. Now, when we look at these protocols, which are not experts, so these are the 2 least experienced participants that we have clinically. On the left, you can see the base case, so they're using the system in its normal form. On the right, you can see with the augmented system, with the knowledge model. And the trend that we think we see emerging is that when the same people use the knowledge model, they reason more at this high level of abstraction that's conducive to problem solving. Now, it's worth pointing out that most of the variation we see in these experiments is actually within subjects. So people, what seems to be the major determinant of people's thought process is their individual characteristics. But when we look at the same person across conditions, we see these sorts of trends emerging. Here's an excerpt from the transcripts of people looking at one of the 2 cases in the ICU setting with this interface. It turns out that in this case, the patient, and these patients were actually not synthetic, so these patients are based on de-identified data, but it's real data. And so it turns out that shortly after the point in time at which we made available to our participants, this patient suffered a myocardial infarction, and there were clear signs at the time at which the patient was viewed that they were unstable. But when we looked at the transcripts at the point at which people were assessing the stability of the patients, the people who didn't use the knowledge model didn't seem terribly concerned about the condition of the patient, and the people who did use the knowledge model were much more concerned, regardless of expertise. Now, this is obviously a very small sample, but I think these qualitative findings are quite suggestive. So I appear to be out of time, but I would just like to say as a final point that what we've tried to do in the SHARPC project is design cognitive support systems that facilitate the recognition of patterns that have life-altering consequences for decision-making. And then also because in my last SHARP talk I was so afraid of Chrisanne that I failed to acknowledge my collaborators. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge all of the people that have been involved in this project since day one. Thank you very much.